Hello, my fabulous ones. Welcome to flip video number 3. Reconstruction changes the South. All right, so we had previously talked about what kind of plans we needed for Reconstruction. We had talked about what life looked like for freedmen before we had any plans for Reconstruction. Well, now we have a plan. What are we going to do? So we start off with the fact that Republicans are dominating the government. So we're looking at, before the Civil War, a limited number of powerful men had controlled the South. In the wake of the war, a very basic question needed to be resolved. Who would gain the power and how would they use it? All right, so if you remember, they were locked out of Congress for a while, right? They could not come in. And so these powerful men, all of a sudden, they didn't have any power and they created a power vacuum. And what's amazing is the African Americans came to fill that vacuum, right? So, how this question is answered at the time would have both immediate and lasting consequences. All right, so with the passing of the 15th Amendment, African Americans were able to vote. All right, so this meant that almost 1,500 of them were able to help bring the Republican Party into power in the South. All right, so no longer are these white landowning men allowed to rule the South. Now you have all these Republicans coming in. And several that were elected were African American. All right. And so if you look at this picture, this is an image of the radical Republican members of South Carolina's first legislature after the Civil War. And if you look very closely, you will see several African Americans in there. All right. This is a remarkable time where you're starting to see African Americans getting involved, getting elected. And it's going to cause some problems. So, with the Republicans dominating the government, let's look at some of the numbers. Okay, so the constitutional conventions in the South Carolina, 61% of the constitutional convention were African American. In Louisiana, 50%. These numbers, I don't think exist yet today, again. So they really got an opportunity. Unfortunately, the further you go, you see a much less participation of African Americans, but they're there, right? And here they are in power in Congress. So this is between 1869 and 1871. You have a couple of them, but here we have it in 1873 and 1875. You're up to having 7 in Congress, and you even get a few in the Senate. So African Americans are really making their presence known, and they're having the ability to create laws. So, with the African Americans taking their place in the government, we now have a large vacuum in the South, right? So, white or African American Northern men were relocating to the South. So, a lot of the Southerners, they lost their land, right? They couldn't afford to keep it or it was destroyed. So, they had no way to replant and move. So, what's happening is people from the North, they're coming down to the South to take over. And these are carpetbaggers, all right? So, they come in and they're buying up the property. If you've ever watched Gone with the Wind, you'll see carpetbaggers come in saying, "Hey, I'm going to buy Tara." And she is really, really upset that these people want to buy her plantation because she feels they weren't worthy. Well, many white Southerners really resented this. So here is a political cartoon. So I want you to pause the recording and really take a look at this cartoon. All right. What did you see? Who is the figure at the bottom? Who is at the top? And what is in the bag with him? And who are the gentlemen at the sides of the bag? So take a look at this. If you need some more time, you need to zoom it in. It's on Teams. We're going to discuss this image when we come together for class tomorrow. And it is a carpetbagger in the South. So really kind of take a look. Look at the surroundings of it. All right. So what are the freedmen doing? We know that the Freedmen Bureau has been closed, it's been defunded. So what are they doing now? Well, we've got a couple of things. So, for newly freed African Americans, the importance of such issues as corruption was matched by the importance of trying to work out the new social institutions and economic relationships that they were now a part of. Right? So now they're starting to get a voice and they need to figure out how to go about doing this. So some freedmen deliberately moved away from the plantations, even if the owner had been a generous person, right? So we talked about this a little bit in class the other day, where um, even though they're free and they have an opportunity to work, they don't necessarily want to stay because they don't trust the white landowners. And one minister put it, as long as the shadow of the great house falls across you, you ain't going to feel like no free man and no free woman. So a lot of them felt like they really couldn't be free unless they moved away. And one of the things that they were able to do, and we talked about how the Freedmen's Bureau helped with this, is they were able to get married. So previously, African Americans were not allowed to be legally married, all right, because that would put issues like moral and ethical issues, believe it or not, in separating families. So if they can't be legally married. Well, now that they're free, they can be legally married. And so they're starting to do a lot of marriages. They're starting to bring families together that were divided. So you're really seeing this boom. And then, of course, education. So this is huge. I mean, it's something to really comprehend here is we grow up being able to go to school. It's almost a right that we get to go to school, right? We do learn so much reading and writing and math and how to communicate with each other. Well, they don't have this opportunity. Well, now the Constitution allows them to have schools. All right. And so they're beginning to form. Now, schools at this time were segregated, and as we know, they're segregated for several decades afterwards. But they start being able to have their own schools, and it was a huge success. Now, take a look at this picture here. All right, you're looking at an African American school. Okay, and if you look, you're going to see people of all ages here in this school. What's interesting, if you look in the far left hand corner, you see somebody sitting down there. That person is an adult and they're going to school too. So, what's unique about their schools is it wasn't just the children that wanted to learn, it's the adults as well. Because remember, everybody was forbidden to learn how to read. And so these schools allowed them to do that. Well, what did they do about the land? So, land distribution in the South was uneven. And it's an agricultural society, so it makes sense that large swaths of land would be owned by one person. You see this a lot out here when you look out of the windows of school here, right? You see farms, and these farms have a whole lot of land. Well, in 1860, the wealthiest 5% of white Southerners owned almost half the region's land. Okay, 5% of white Southerners owned the land. So these plantations were massive. A lot of the family farms that you see today were broken up from these huge plantations, right? Well, after the war, landless Southern white people were competing with landless African American people for jobs. And that's where we're going to see a huge tension. If you want to pay attention to themes, if you're taking notes, here's a theme. All right. So the African Americans and the poor whites are fighting for work. Okay, so all of a sudden you're seeing people from the north, poor white northerners are coming down because there's jobs, right? They're all the jobs that the slaves had are now paid positions. And so this is causing a big tension because everybody, needs to work. And with that came new ways to farm. Okay, so we have sharecropping and tenant farming. Now, these are very, very important. You will see them on tests. Sharecropping and tenant farming. This is how, like, the main way that farming took place in the South after the Civil War. Let's start with sharecropping. Okay, so what sharecropping is the landowner is dedicating the crop and a place to live in return for share of the profit. So what happens here is, and this is typically African Americans, because remember, they don't have anything. They don't have clothing. They don't have a home. They don't have a way to work a farm, right? So these guys are going to the plantation owners' farms, and the plantation owner is saying, okay, you get this amount of land, you get a house on the land, and you get tools. Great. You'll be all set up. All right. Oh, wait, you need clothing. All right. Well, here's the deal. Out of your profit from your crop, I'm going to take a fee for your clothing, for your tools, for your food, and for your seed. All right. So all of a sudden, these sharecroppers are all of a sudden in debt, and it's called wage slavery. Okay, they can't leave because they're stuck in debt to the land. So even once they sell their crop, they can't get caught up, and so they have to keep borrowing money. So same thing happens like with medical care; they have to keep borrowing money. All right, and this is something that's really common for African Americans, and it kind of keeps them in slavery after the Civil War. It's the way that the Southerners legally kept them in bondage. And then you have tenant farming. Okay, so this is what the poor white farmers were able to do. Tenant farming is just like renting a house, but you're renting a farm. Okay, so the farmer would come in, they'd have their own tools, they'd have their own clothes, they'd have their own food. All they were doing is renting the land and homes. So it was a set price, and they'd rent that, and they'd pay it to the landowner, and that's that. So they were never borrowing anything from the landowner. They just paid the landowner to use the land. There was another challenge. So here come the African Americans. One thing that they were not familiar with previously is the need to sell their crops. So they don't know how to negotiate. They don't know what the right prices were. And so unfortunately, a lot of African American farmers who sold their crop often found the value for their crop lower than anticipated. So their crop, they got paid less than the white guy would get paid. So that also kept them in wage slavery. And now, changes in the South are sparking violence. So we're starting to build up this tension, right? The African Americans are taking jobs. They're the whites are having to pay them now. They're really resenting this. And there's martial law going on, because remember, they were separated into 5 districts. The southern states were. They're separated into 5 districts and kept under martial law until they all are at peace and rejoined in the Union. So here we have the struggle to make a living in a region devastated by war led to fierce economic competition. And this put blacks and whites against each other for jobs and incited violence. So now we have the KKK. This is where they first start to come in, okay? So they're a loosely organized group of white supremacists. They terrified freed African Americans and their supporters during Reconstruction. They really wanted to keep African Americans in a subservient role. They wanted to keep them with the slave mentality, okay? And the biggest thing is they want to keep them from voting, because if they can't vote, they're not going to put their African American friends in these high positions. Their white friends are going to get back into position, and they can change the laws. And unfortunately, the most well-known Klan at the time, it was the one from Tennessee. So what did the government do about it? Okay, so they're aware of all this violence. What do? The violence against the African American voters and their supporters grew and spread throughout the South and North. And so what they did was they passed the Enforcement Acts. And the Enforcement Act made it a federal offense to interfere with citizens' right to vote. Unfortunately, it really did not completely protect them. There was really no way to enforce it unless you had like the soldiers right there when they were voting. All right, so there you have it. Reconstruction changes the South. Flipped video number 3. If you have any questions, please let me know.